Chapter 5. The New Testament, its name and content. We will begin with its name. The name, New Testament, which is given to the second half of the English Bible, comes from the Latin Novum Testamentum, which is itself a translation of the Greek he kain diatheke, anglicized. The Greek term was generally used to mean a last will, or testament, as the Latin translation indicated, but this translation did not exhaust its meaning. The word really meant an arrangement made by one party which may be accepted or rejected by another party, but which he cannot alter, and which, when accepted, binds both parties by its terms. Since a will is the best example of such an instrument, the Latin testamentum, preserved in the English Testament, was used. The term covenant used in the Revised Version is derived from the Old French convenir, to agree, which in turn is derived from the Latin convenire, to come together. It means an agreement, stipulation, or contract which involves both parties in the agreement. It implies more than a promise, for a promise obligates only the person making it, whereas a covenant obligates both parties concerned in it. In this respect it approximates the modern term, contract. Such is the meaning of the word covenant as used in Exodus 24:1-8, which describes the acceptance of the law by the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. The fact that the Greek translator of the Old Testament uses diatheke in this passage to render the Hebrew word for covenant indicates that diatheke may on occasion have this meaning, and this usage is confirmed by the language of Luke 22:14-20, where the Old Covenant of Exodus 24:1-8 is contrasted with the New Covenant which Jesus made with his disciples at the Last Supper. The general meaning of the Greek term must be the same in both instances as the contrast of Old and New implies. The New Testament, then, is the record of the character and establishment of a new dealing of God with men through Christ. God sets the terms which man can accept or reject but cannot alter, and when man accepts them, both he and God are obligated to fulfill their requirements. The Old Covenant involved a revelation of the holiness of God in a righteous standard of law which those who received it were solemnly enjoined to keep. The New Covenant embodies a revelation of the holiness of God in an utterly righteous Son, who empowers those who receive the revelation to become sons of God by making them righteous. John 1:12. Next is the content. The contents of the New Testament consist of the revelation of this new covenant through the recorded words of Jesus Christ and of his followers. It comprises 27 distinct pieces of writing by 9 different authors, unless Paul is regarded as the author of Hebrews, in which case the number is reduced to 8. These documents were written over a span of a little more than half a century, probably from AD 45 at the earliest to about AD 100. The historical allusions in them cover the entire 1st century, and their background of cultural thought reaches back into the 4th or 5th century BC. The contents of the New Testament may be classified in 3 ways: by literary character, by authors, and by periods. Literary character: the first 5 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, are historical in character. All of them narrate a story. The first 4 sketch from different viewpoints the life and work of Jesus. Acts is a companion volume to Luke and carries on the story of Jesus' followers after the close of his earthly life, with special emphasis on the career of Paul, the missionary. The following books are largely doctrinal: Romans, I and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, I and 2 Thessalonians, Hebrews, James, I and 2 Peter, Jude, I John. Most of these were written in the form of letters to churches for the purpose of instructing them in the elements of Christian belief and in the practice of Christian ethics. None of them, with the possible exception of Romans, was written as a formal argument. They were largely informal in approach and dealt with the current emergencies in the groups to which they were directed. Still another group can be called personal: I and 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 2 and 3 John. These were written as personal letters to individuals, not to groups, and were intended to be used for private instruction and counsel. Because their recipients were engaged in the leadership of the churches, however, the books took on a significance wider than that of private epistles and came to be regarded as public documents. Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, is prophetic. It purports to deal with the future as well as with the present. Because of its highly symbolic style, involving visions and supernatural disclosures, it is also classed with apocalyptic literature. This classification is not final or exclusive. There is much doctrine in the historical books and some prophecy in the doctrinal epistles. The classification holds only for general content. Next are the authors. These books may also be grouped by authors. All of the writers were Jews, except Luke. 3, presumably Matthew, Peter, and John, were members of the apostolic band. Mark, Jude, and James had been active in the early church, or had been in contact with the apostolic group even before the death of Jesus. Luke and Paul, while not eyewitnesses of the life of Christ, were well known to those who were, and were certainly able to compare notes with them if necessary. Of the author of Hebrews nothing is known by external evidence, hence his name does not appear in the summary. The books of the New Testament were not written in the order in which they appear in the Bible. One must not assume that because the Gospels precede the Pauline epistles in literary order that they are necessarily older. Furthermore, there may be a considerable difference between the date at which a writing was composed and the period with which it deals. Mark, for instance, describes the events in Jesus' life which took place within the last of the third decade of the first century, but the Gospel may not have been circulated publicly until between AD 65 and AD 70. In order to facilitate the study of the history of the first century, it may be divided into three periods of unequal length, each of which marks a definite stage in its development. The first is the period of inception, which covers the lifetime of Christ from 6 BC to AD 29. This period is described by the four Gospels, which narrate with differing degrees of fullness the significant facts in the career of Jesus, and which give casual references to other historical events. The second period of expansion, AD 29 to AD 60, witnessed the development of the missionary enterprise. Groups of preachers traveled the Roman roads in all directions, evangelizing and founding new churches in various important centers. The narrative of Acts affords chiefly a view of the Pauline mission to the Gentiles, with only occasional glimpses of the activities of other apostles and preachers. During this time the gospel progressed from Jerusalem to Rome, and doubtless into many other localities not noted by the author of Acts. Within this period fall also the majority of the Pauline epistles which were written during Paul's missionary career. Considerable knowledge of the growth of the Gentile church can be gleaned from them. The third period from AD 60 to AD 100 may be called consolidation. In some respects it is the period of mystery, for little is told of the history of the church at this time. There is no consecutive account of it as the book of Acts affords for the preceding epoch, and what little history can be reconstructed must be pieced together from hints provided in various writings. To the early part of this period belong the pastoral epistles of Paul and the Petrine writings. Luke, Acts and Matthew were probably published between AD 60 and AD 70. Mark may have been composed at an earlier date, but if tradition be correct, it may not have been widely published until this era. Hebrews and Jude probably precede AD 70. The Johannine writings, the fourth Gospel and the epistles, may have appeared as late as AD 85 to AD 90. The Apocalypse should probably be assigned to the reign of Domitian in AD 96, or thereabouts. A survey of this literature will show that in the last third of the first century the church was rapidly consolidating into a recognized institution. From being a scattered collection of isolated bands of believers, each with its own problems and with its own standards, it was beginning to acquire social and doctrinal solidarity and to be regarded as a potent factor in society. The Gospels show that the narrative preaching about the life of the Lord Jesus had become an accepted type of evangelism and had crystallized into a pattern which was used for instruction of believers. Acts, the first history of the Christian Church, is a conscious attempt to explain the fusion of Jew and Gentile into one body through Christian experience. The epistles of the period deal with heresies which in themselves imply the existence of some orthodox framework of belief. The book of Hebrews and the Johannine writings show that the church had already been compelled to face the claims of the law and the inroads of a progressive faith which progressed by abandoning a sound Christology. The threat of persecution, too, is reflected in Hebrews, Peter, and Revelation. The pastorals indicate that even at the close of Paul's career many of these issues were current and that a decline of spiritual life had already affected some of the churches. Exact chronological placement of the books of the New Testament is impossible. No one of them is dated by figure, and only a few contain such unmistakable allusions to the time of their writing that they can be assigned to a given year of the Christian era. Opinions of scholars vary greatly on some of these books. John, for instance, has been dated from the 5th decade of the 1st century to the middle years of the 2nd century. Most conservative scholars would locate it about AD 85, though it may be earlier. One can only approximate a correct order for these books. Exactitude is impossible in consideration of present lack of knowledge. The accompanying diagram is intended to show approximately how the books are related to the time which they describe and in which they were written. Further discussion on the chronological problems will be offered in connection with each individual writing. In dealing with the Gospels, three chronological relations must be considered. The first is the time of which the Gospels speak and to which their narrative mainly relates. The second is the period in which their material was composed and in which it was shaped to the needs and usage of the church. The composition may have been wholly written or wholly oral, or it may have been partly both. The third is the actual date of publication, when the written copy of each gospel first saw the light and began to be used as an authoritative document by some church or churches. The epistles were apparently written for some specific occasion and were published at some definite date without having been previously connected with the general body of preaching except where noted in the individual treatment of each book.